Hello everyone. A quick thing before the video. I'm sorry that my voice sounds very low pitched. Yes, my PC or mic or audio interface thing had a bit of a mare and it decided to make me really low pitched. So yes, I know it's not ideal, but at least you can still hear what I'm saying. Anyway, enjoy the video as we have a chat with EFL journalist Gabriel Sutton.
So, hello everyone. I'm Nathan Richards. I'm studying sports journalism at Birmingham City University, and as part of my course, I'm going to have an interview with someone who works in the sports journalism field already. Of course, if you are a big fan of the EFL, you've probably seen Gab somewhere on Twitter or TikTok or YouTube. But Gab, thanks for coming on. Great to have you with us. First of all, we'll go straight into the questions. How long have you been a journalist? Because if I'm honest, I've never really seen you talk much about your story as a journalist.
Sure, yeah. So I started out in officially, I would say, in 2014, when I set up a website called the Football Lab. But essentially, instead of going to university, which we felt like might cost quite a lot of money at that time, might be quite a big investment, it was basically like investing in a 3-year period where if that went well, I would earn from it, and if not, after that period, we'd kind of go back to the drawing board, kind of thing, in terms of my career. But yeah, so essentially, I invested in my website, the Football Lab, in terms of time and making that almost like a full-time job. And then off the back of that work, the website had a bit of success. It won the Football Blogging Awards in 2016, which is now it won a category, the best new football blog, and which is now the Football Content Awards. Yeah, that's kind of how it all started. And from that point onwards, I started to get offers to write for other websites, and it kind of snowballed from there. But in answer to your question, yeah, I've been going for around 11 years.
Certainly, and of course, when you started doing journalism, was it started off with the EFL, or was it like a mixture of different sports to kind of figure out what your thing was?
Yeah, so it was all football. I've never covered another sport, but initially, when I built the Football Lab, it was the Football League and the Premier League.
Hmm.
But because what I actually found was that often the Football League content would sometimes get more views actually than Premier League stuff because it was more rare for somebody to cover Premier League football. So although with the Premier League, sorry, it's more rare for somebody to cover the Football League because although for the Premier League you've got a wider potential audience, you've also got far more content creators and journalists to compete with, and it's much harder to stand out from the crowd. Whereas for the Football League, because there's fewer sort of league-wide less league-wide coverage, it became easier for me to stand out in that sense. So that helped a lot.
Yeah, certainly. And of course, journalism and, many parts of the media industry is not your typical 9 to 5 job, not something that everybody kind of ends up going to when they leave,
Mm.
school or college or university. Was being a journalist always your plan, or was it just something that just kind of fell into place due to your passions?
Yeah, it's a good question. I think I think it was definitely a plan when I started out to get into journalism. And I would always sort of advise people to make that decision when they're young, because I think when you're very young, you've got that freedom and that choice to decide to go. Whereas, if you do it later in life, there's more commitments and it's maybe hard to break into the industry. But yeah, so it was definitely a plan. Yeah, I feel very lucky to be doing something that I'm passionate about.
Yeah, certainly. And of course, with being a journalist, you get to have quite a lot of privileges that other people don't, in terms of visiting certain football grounds, certain, I don't know, like sports, landmarks, I suppose you could say, and also get to speak and, question some of the sport's biggest, players, managers, and people that are just surrounded behind the scenes. What was your favorite moment of your career so far?
Favorite moment of my career so far, I think probably would be winning the Football Blogging Awards with when the website did that in 2016 because I mean, from a personal point of view, my dad had passed away, a few months before that, so that was quite a nice sort of. It was quite a sort of bittersweet moment, I suppose, but it was kind of quite nice to be able to honour my father in that way. So I think that was quite a nice thing for me. And then also, I've really enjoyed interviewing managers and getting, especially in the sort of the sit down interviews and getting a feel
Yeah.
for how their mind works and how they relate to people and their leadership style. So that I always enjoy.
Certainly. And of course, there's many things that journalists should do and shouldn't do, or, in quotes, should and shouldn't do. In your opinion, what are the type of things that people should be doing when they're, getting into journalism? What is the things that they shouldn't be doing in journalism?
Sure. I think what they should be doing, you've got to carve a niche for yourself. Because I think what the biggest, if there's one thing for anyone watching or listening to this who wants to get into journalism, the first thing that I would always say is you've got to find a way of standing out. So for me, it was covering, dropping down the leagues and covering the football league as a way of standing out and being a bit different. If you decide you want to cover the top level of football, if that's the sport you want to cover, you've got to then come up with an angle or a niche that's something that everyone can expect from your journalism and a way of looking at things that's fresh. So whether you've got a great understanding of the financial side of the game and the accountants and that kind of thing, or the legal side and stuff like that, or whether you've got a good understanding of the fitness and sports science side, but or the psychology side, the leadership, or you cover, a league that's a bit more obscure. Whatever, and think about what your skill set are, what your credentials are, what your contacts are, and then try to build a brand and an identity from there. I think that's really important. So you've got to carve a niche for yourself.
Yeah, certainly. And what would you say that people shouldn't do as a journalist, whether it's at a low level or someone that's, professional in that field?
I would say always prioritize good relationships. So I think if you're unfair, so sometimes when a manager's under pressure, you might be able to get likes and retweets by saying something derogatory about that manager because media in general is determined by the most extreme things that you say. It grabs attention, you get more clicks, you get more engagement, all that kind of thing. But if in the long run you build a reputation for yourself as someone who isn't trustworthy, that's really much harder to build a sustainable career. So I think if you always try and be balanced and level-headed, and even if you say that manager had to go, but I respected this about him, and I think this was difficult, but on the end I thought this. I think at least then you give yourself a bit of respect. So definitely respect people in the game. I think is really important. And treating difficult conversations with in a very balanced and level-headed way. I think that's really important.
Yeah, definitely. And I think as well, obviously, most people think of sports journalism as football just because I think categorically is the biggest sport on the planet at the moment, or at least,
Sure.
meets it in certain aspects. How easy would you say it is for people to transition? So if you're in football, is it quite similar to go and do rugby covering or cricket or Formula One, or do you have to take different skills to different areas, do you think?
Well, first thing to say is I've got no idea because I don't have that experience of covering
Yeah.
other sports. But I think one thing I would say is try and be really clear about what you can offer people because what you want is to be identified as the guy who does this and the guy who does that. So you might have certain fleeting interests, and it's quite natural for people to want a variety and to not feel like they're doing the same thing every day. And in the short term, that's really understandable. But in the long term, if you want to build a profile for yourself and a way that people relate to you, I think having quite a narrow, certainly in the early stages of your career, a narrow niche, I think that's really important. I wouldn't spread yourself too wide. I would focus on having a narrow, clear niche and being as good at that bit as you possibly can. So that would be my advice.
Certainly. And I know that we've spoke a little bit about different tips that, for upcoming journalists and maybe people that are studying journalism in university. But have you got any other tips that people should kind of keep an eye on through their early career?
So definitely carving a niche is the biggest one I can offer. Definitely consistency is really
Yeah.
important. So um, I think if you produce good work week in, week out, I think that consistency is so important, and it's one of the hardest things because lots of people want to get into football journalism, and consistency is one of the big things that separates people who do from people who don't. The third thing I would say is contacts. Contacts are so important. I would say certainly for football, because I can't really speak about other sports. Out of work managers are a good little tip. If you can get in touch with out work managers, they're often people who have a lot of time on their hands, as well as a lot of experience and valuable insight and information. And so, if you can get interviews with them, you only have to negotiate with them. Whereas with media teams, for in work managers, they don't have much time, and you've got to go through the media team because that's the protocol. And there's lots of complications with getting interviews with in work managers. So when you're starting out, I would target out of work managers and talk to them. And then that can, when you've got one contact and you've established a rapport with them, that can sometimes be the gateway to another. So, for instance, I landed an interview with a manager called Alex Neil, who managed Sunderland and Stoke City and Norwich, Preston, and it was the first time he'd spoken out or spoken since his openly since leaving Sunderland under a bit of a cloud at the time, and and that was a massive gig. But it was only because I knew somebody else who he'd worked with for a couple of weeks that I asked them for Alex Neil's contact, and that was a bit of a scoop that nobody else had spoken to him. So it's those contacts. Once you get one contact, that's I would say one contact is the gateway to a million. If you get one, that can be a real domino effect. So there's three things that I would say. There's carve a niche for yourself. There's be very consistent, and there's utilize your contacts. So those would be the three things that I would say that's really
Perfect.
important.
Perfect. Thank you. And of course, you've worked for the BBC in the past. You've done some work for the EFL, the EFL at, different grounds. You've obviously present the EFL debate. And obviously, how would you say that kind of is different compared to people that do journalism independently? I know that you do your own stuff. And how would you say it's different working for a big organisation compared to doing it all by yourself?
Well, so all of that is kind of freelance. My podcast doesn't have any relation to the official EFL.
Yeah.
It's just very much thing that I create off my own bat. I like working freelance because it does give you some flexibility. So if one bit of work for one client sort of falls through, you're not overly reliant on that client. So that helps. Yeah, I've definitely enjoyed working for big names like the BBC and 442 and all that kind of thing. I find that really rewarding from a prestige point of view, and then that can help get you more offers.
Yeah, certainly. And of course, obviously, a lot of journalists start going into writing, but of course, there's so many different, types of journalism you can do. What would you say is your big tip when it comes to writing? Because obviously, in university, at least for the first year, from what I've seen, a heavy focus is on that writing element. What would you say? What would you say is the first thing you should do if you think about setting up a website to start writing?
Sure. Well, I think writing, one thing I found is it's very different, the climate to 2025 to 2014, which is when I started out, because I think in 2025, the way people consume content has changed. So, for a journalist starting out, I don't even know if I would recommend doing loads of writing as opposed to maybe having a TikTok account and offering your opinions on things that way, because that can be a very good way of boosting, building up a following quickly, and gaining some work from there. So if you can cover something niche and you've got a different angle on things, but you create a TikTok account, and I think once you get to 10,000 followers, there's a way of monetizing. So that would be an angle that I would consider for a journalist, maybe as well as to complement the writing, which I think can be valuable as well. So definitely evolving the way that you produce content is important, because the way people consume content has evolved. So initially I started out just being a writing guy, and in the last 6 or 7 years, I've evolved and moved more towards the podcasting and video side.
Yeah, definitely. And of course, in sport, we know that every journalist most of the time has, a favorite football team or a favorite, team in whatever sport they like. How important would you say it is to keep yourself not biased and to kind of keep a neutral head when you're doing writing or podcasts and etc.?
Yeah, I think that's really important. I think there is definitely a compromise. I think when you become a journalist, it's harder to be a fan, and
Mhm.
there's definitely a trade-off. Like for me, I'm a Birmingham City fan, and because I don't go home and away like I used to,
Mhm.
um, there is something where, and because I'm often covering other games at
So we know that bias, is quite, I'd say, big in sports journalism. I think we see that a lot, for some of the big organisations. People kind of clearly say, what sort of team they support, and they kind of have that emotional reaction when that team wins or loses. How important would you say it is for a journalist to kind of keep unbiased?
Yeah, I think it's really important. I think there's definitely a trade-off in the sense that you don't support your team home and away if you're a journalist. That's just one of the sacrifices that you've got to be prepared to make. I think you definitely gain more respect if you're very neutral about things in the way that you cover things. I don't think it's a huge problem if people know who you support,
Yeah.
as long as they recognise that there's a boundary and that when you're covering football in a journalism capacity, they know that you've got to be very fair and balanced. So yeah, I think that's really important.
Certainly. And of course, the final question, this could probably be answered in a million different ways, but in your opinion, how important is journalism in the world of sport?
I think it's really important. I think journalism is definitely in a transitional period now where newspaper and print journalism has definitely struggled. And I think the industry is definitely evolving, and we're kind of, is the subscription model going to work, and the way people consume information is changing. But I think that good quality journalism still has a value because that's how we challenge things, and that's how we sort of get to the truth in things. So I think that's really important.
Of course, the recording stopped before we actually managed to say goodbye to Gab. But yes, a big thanks to Gab for joining us today. Great to hear his side of the story of how he got into journalism, sports journalism specifically, and then also giving us some tips and tricks to help some new, young, and upcoming journalists like myself get a pathway into the industry. So I hope you enjoyed this video, and hopefully there'll be more little podcast and interview type videos coming up on the channel shortly.